perspective from someone who's not very opinionated on anything, Linus Torvalds. And here Linus was talking about someone forking the kernel, the Linux kernel. And of course he's slightly biased because he wrote the Linux kernel, but his point was that people decide that forking something is what ought to be done, and then once they fork it, they realize, well, gee, and now I've got this thing, and I really can't do any more with it than what was being done with it before, so maybe I shouldn't have gone to all the effort. So as I say, a fork is a natural divergence. When I say natural, what I mean is you wouldn't take a project that's devoted to an open source video driver and say, this ought to be an audio driver, and fork the video driver. That doesn't really work unless there's a common driver code base and you want to focus more on driving one thing than another. But if it's specific to a video driver, writing an audio driver is not a fork, that's a separate project entirely. The idea behind the fork is when you don't want to start over and reinvent the wheel. It is definitely not the first step in a process. It's at the right time when it's really the only thing to do so that you feel you can move forward without reinventing the wheel. Sometimes a fork is necessary because project maintainers are unavailable. So you request a change in an open source project and no one responds. There's just dead air. And you don't have access to the repository to become the de facto maintainer of the current project. And you normally can't just take over a project anyway. You need to talk to the current project lead and discuss with him whether he wants to actually step back and let someone else take over. So maybe you don't get any response at all when you make that request. Sometimes that's because the project has simply been abandoned. Maybe there was one maintainer and he died. There is no one to step in. Maybe there was more than one maintainer and they had a big argument and now neither one is talking. This happens also. Remember, these open source projects are often community-driven projects. These aren't things that people do because they're making a living doing them. They do them because they want to do them. When they no longer want to do them, it doesn't matter how many people depend upon the work, it's just not worth it for them to do it anymore. Sometimes the code has been lost. I talk a lot on my blog about how I dislike the concept of the cloud. And I dislike the concept of storing code on someone else's server over which I have no control, located somewhere I have no idea, and paying money for that, no less. So that Vlad in Estonia, in his spare time, can pull all of my code down and do whatever he wants with it anyway, and when I need support, he's not there to answer the phone. Sometimes these places come into existence and then they go out of business and you can't find anyone and the code is gone. The only place it exists is in the hands of the few people who had checked it out before, and maybe someone's got a newer version of the code than you have, maybe not. Sometimes the project maintainers are around, but they're unwilling to listen to what you want to do. So you send an email to the project maintainers because it says on the website for the project, if there is a specific request for a change, please let us know. And you say, well, the background on your program is green. I really think it should be red. And this is a real problem for me. I have vision problems, and it needs to be read. If it's not read, it needs to be customizable. And the project maintainers say, you know what? Go use something else. We're not going to be bothered making that change for you. And you try again. You ask very nicely, please, would you do this? No, that doesn't interest us at all. Well, that's kind of the whole point of open source, is that you can then take it and do what you want with it. Maybe they say our design philosophy is that everything in the background of this program has to be green, because the whole paradigm of this program is money management. So we don't want to make it red. Who wants to be in the red? Who wants to be in the black? We want to be in the green. So therefore, the backgrounds all have to be green, some shade of green. If you want it blue, we're not going to make it blue. And sometimes the project maintainers are incapable of making changes. Let's say someone came into the project to design new icons. And it's 15 years down the road, and the original maintainers, the project leads, have left the project, and the only guy left standing is the guy who came on to do some icons. He's not capable of coding in C. That wasn't his shtick in the first place. He was there simply to design some icons. He can't make the change that you want to have made. He would very much like to help you, but he is just not in a position to do so. So he may have inherited the code, but can't do anything with it. Also, sometimes you can't get the point across to the project maintainers. Maybe English is not their first language. And so it seems that it would be more of an effort to try to translate your request into a language that the maintainers can understand, knowing that down the road you're going to have to go back the other direction because they're going to send something back to you in a different language. And then you'll have to send something back to them in their language. Sometimes it's just easier to split the project in two. So when do you fork? After all other possibilities have been exhausted. You try going the usual route first. Forking is not a first step, as I said. So you do it when you want to change the direction or the focus of the project. You change it when you fork when you feel the need to add or remove features. Maybe the project has become so bloated with things that you believe in your heart of hearts most of the people using the software will not need or want. And it's just so cluttered at this point that it has actually become less usable than when it was simpler. Yeah. And you should also consider an entirely new project. What would it take to start this over from scratch and do something similar to this, but with a code base I can manage in a language in which I'm comfortable working and where I'm not beholden to anyone else? Remember, we're talking open source here, so it's not quite the same thing as saying, I like Lotus 1-2-3, and I want to make a spreadsheet program that looks just like Lotus 1-2-3. That's not a good idea. It's not a good idea. But open source, sure. You want to make an interface that looks like another open source spreadsheet? Knock yourself out. So, unless you know everyone using the software, you should make a public announcement that you're preparing to fork a project. Make it known to the general public. And you don't need to be specific with your reasoning. In other words, you don't need to say, Jack was such that I decided to fork the project. And the horse he rode in on at the same time. Just state that you feel you have a an idea that is best explored with a fork of the main project instead of in the main project. It's not necessary to get anyone's consent or approval. It's open source software. You can do whatever you want. If you're going to fork the project, you need to determine a point in time when the project most closely resembles where you want to start. It doesn't make sense to start with the latest version of the project and back up. The point of source code revision, revision control software is so you can grab a point in time along the way and build from that particular point. So pick a point in time when the software was usable for you, when it had everything in it that you think it should have had in it at that time, and start from that revision. Make that your revision 0. Commit that code after you check it out to a new repository and begin your work. Now, normally, when you commit the code, when you decide on the revision and you check out, you commit the code, it's generally a good idea to be able to go back through the revisions leading up to the point at which you forked. So if you fork at revision 322 and the current project is at revision 719, and you commit 322, you should be able to back up in your own repository to 321, 320, 319, 318. They may not be, I mean, that makes it, pardon me, I lost my train of thought. That makes it easier for you to go back. Let's say you discover a bug in 322. You say, well, I didn't remember that there was a bug in 322, and I don't see anything in the main project that said that that bug was fixed after that point. So it must have been fixed by accident by something else that I'm not putting in. So let me roll back to find out when that bug made its way into the code. You can then back up in your own repository to find where that bug was and identify it. If you just take a snapshot at that particular point in time and that becomes revision 0 for you, now you can't back up from that point. So it makes your debugging process more complicated. Sometimes you don't really have a choice in the matter. Sometimes there has been code added to the repository that makes it almost impossible for you to check it out at a certain point in time and then back up. Sometimes the main repository has been altered to the point where backing up is not practical. You have to accept that when you make the fork. I mean, the bottom line is when you decide to make the fork, it becomes your baby. You assume the responsibility for it. So, like everything else, a little forethought goes a long way. Then you can begin your work. Now, some OS2 specific considerations. Where are you going to host the repository for your fork? You have a couple of options. NetLabs is an excellent first choice. Adrian runs NetLabs. Adrian doesn't really use OS2 anymore, personally. He's moved on to Linux for most of his stuff, as far as I know. But he is still very committed to the principles of NetLabs and very responsive. Unlike Vlad in Estonia, he's not going to disappear tomorrow and just leave you hanging and just shut everything down. Adrian's one of us. He's part of the community. I don't expect him to go away. So the code is safe there. GitHub, there are advantages to using Git for version control. NetLabs uses SVN. This class is not a discussion of version control software. So there are reasons to use Git or SVN. Git does some things better than SVN does some things, and SVN does other things more easily than they can be accomplished in Git.
There's a Git on OS2.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, they needed Git for the Mozilla code because it was unwieldy in SVN. When you do when you do tagging and whatnot, it's easier to do it in Git than it is in SVN. And there are other operations that are just more efficient in Git than they are in SVN. A very brief 2-sentence history on Git. Linus Torvalds invented Git specifically for the Linux kernel because he found that the other source control software that was available wasn't up to the task. So he designed it for his needs. GitHub was built around Git. And yeah, Git's a very powerful thing, but pros and cons to everything. And sometimes it's the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. I know SVN much better than I know Git.
So much trust Microsoft.
And now Microsoft owns GitHub. So we're back to talking about Vlad and Estonia running the server, right?
Only they're just going to turn it off.
They're just going to turn it off, yeah. And then when you
How
set,
do you know that the things are going to be around? Anything's going to be around.
you know what my right-hand IT guy working with me says all the time? If you want a guarantee, buy a toaster. GitHub's a big business. I mean, they host a lot of things. I don't particularly like GitHub. I didn't like GitHub before Microsoft bought GitHub because I don't like the whole social aspect of GitHub. I also don't like the fact that it complains to me about what browser I'm using, that I'm not using a new enough browser and I have to fake it out into thinking that I'm running Firefox 56, which is really all that I need to do. Once I tell it I'm running Firefox 56, it runs pretty much just fine for me on CMonkey 235. But it's an option. It's an option. Bitwise swears by GitHub. It works very well for them. It might work very well for you. I'm not advocating one way or the other. I'm saying that these are options. There are other places. You can still host projects at SourceForge. Paul Smedley still has a SourceForge page. So you can still host stuff at SourceForge. It's fine. And which one?
Bitbucket.
Oh, Bitbucket. Dave Yo hosts his Firefox and Thunderbird and CMonkey builds at Bitbucket. There are choices, and well-known choices, places that we don't expect to just go away tomorrow. But you need to find a place to put it. You can, as I say, or you can host it yourself. You get one of these little NAS boxes that's got network attached storage, so it's got 1 or 2 disk drives in it, and they actually put little Linux servers in there. And with a click of a button from a web interface, you can install Apache Web Server, and you can install a mail server, and a firewall, and an SVN or a Git repository for yourself. And then you can host it for yourself on your own little box with mirrored drives in it and everything. So there are plenty of options, but you need to decide. Yes, you can move it later on, but it's easier if you make the right decision first and go with that. In the OS2 community, we're a small group. As computing environments go, we're a small group. So when you decide to fork a project, the idea is not to do it with any kind of malice or bad feelings towards the original project maintainer or anyone else involved. There are too few of us to squabble amongst ourselves over something as trivial as forking a project. And you should be open to input from others, because let's face it, before you started this whole forking thing, you tried to provide input to the original maintainers. So you should know at that point what it's like to have someone slam the door in your face when you suggest a change to something. So you don't want to do that to other people. Here's a real life example. At Arkanoe, we forked the FAT32 project. That was not our original intent. Our original intent was to pick up FAT32 at 0913, which is essentially where it left off in ECS when, I don't remember who did the last bit of work to it. Was it Ko Myung Hun who did the last bit of work to FAT32? I don't recall. But the intent was to pick it up from there and improve upon it for the things that we wanted to see in Arca OS. In the meantime, Bitwise had engaged Valerius to work on the FAT32. And Valerius was motivated because, as part of the OS4 project, there were certain things that he wanted to do for OS4 in the FAT32 project. But the things that he wanted to do differed from the things that we wanted to do or that we could do. His concept is more along the lines of a universal FAT driver that supports replacing the FAT16 support in the OS2 kernel with something that's VFAT aware, FAT32, EXFAT. So essentially a unified FAT file system driver. Our philosophy is we just want a FAT32 driver. We already have a usable FAT16 driver, and we really could not care less about VFAT at this point. VFAT was an issue when we had Windows 95. VFAT is not a real issue today. People are not really concerned about long file names on a 16-bit FAT volume. They're concerned about moving files from a Windows machine to an OS2 machine that have file names that are that long. And they don't do that on FAT16. They do that on FAT32. So we just wanted a FAT32 driver. David mentioned before about EXFAT. EXFAT is Microsoft's latest 64-bit FAT file system. Microsoft owns software patents for EXFAT. They license EXFAT technology to certain companies for use in their products. Specifically, they license the technology to hardware manufacturers, such as digital camera manufacturers, so that they can use large SD cards to store data in a very large FAT file system, not NTFS. We approached them about getting a license for Arca OS, and they said it's not that they priced a license out of reach. They said they were not interested in granting licenses for EXFAT to companies that were not producing hardware. Well, we don't produce hardware, so that wasn't going to work for us. What that meant was, no, you may not use EXFAT. You may not distribute EXFAT. There is a bit of an argument about whether EXFAT is legal to distribute by someone who does not have a license. Samsung posted the EXFAT code on a publicly available space and announced that it was open source. There were no open source licenses in the EXFAT code. They were called on that. The Free Software Foundation contacted them and said, you know, you said that this is open source, but there's no open source license in it. So then there was an open source license added to the code that Samsung released on the public website. The problem is that if I take your code that you have licensed to me for my use, I can't just decide that that's open source now, because it's not my code. It's still your code. So Samsung adding an open source license to code that they don't own is like me selling you the Brooklyn Bridge. I'm very happy to sell you the Brooklyn Bridge, by the way.
No, but is code made from something or is code?
It's code that Samsung originally licensed from Microsoft for their own products.
Okay, but it's code generated by Microsoft.
It's Microsoft's code.
Because the software patents are another
code
things,
from IBM.
are the ownership of the idea that the software does. Not the ownership of the code.
Whether Samsung wrote the code or
Okay.
not, the code uses Microsoft's patented EXFAT
Yeah.
technology. So, it-
Uses the idea, the Microsoft patent idea.
the problem is that you can't come up with another way to write to a proprietary file system without using elements of that proprietary file system.
Using the idea, yeah.
Call it the idea.
It is like HPFS, is patented by Microsoft.
Correct.
The idea of how I'm going to put the blocks is made by Microsoft. So if you code it that way, you're taking the idea from Microsoft, and that's a software patent. Well, maybe that patent is already.
You have to see the way the patent is written.
Yeah, but maybe that patent is already invalid because of time. But that is, you put the idea of how I'm going to put the blocks, and I patent that idea. I can
Yes.
write code to
Yes.
to how to say, to execute that idea. The code is mine,
Mhm.
but I'm using the idea that is patented by other. So that is the issue. Yeah.
It's a nice argument. I don't know whether that holds up though.
No, it doesn't hold because software patents are legal. So if you have money, they will take it out.
Karen,
That was in '89, that HPFS, and that HPFS later on became, with Microsoft's changes, NTFS.
NTFS.
And it was the same character that identified the file system. And it was a joint patent. It was IBM and Microsoft
Yep.
for HPFS.
Okay.
So did you get a copy of the code?
Well, anyone can get a copy of the code.
It's still there?
But, you know, when you look, and I will tell you this, that when you're an individual doing an open source project, the chance that a company like Microsoft is going to come after you for copyright infringement on something like that is slim to none. When you're a commercial enterprise selling a product that includes that technology, that's a far cry. So we err on the side of caution. If we're going to get sued by anyone, I really don't want to get sued by Microsoft.
But that code's still sitting up there and you can go get it?
As far as I know, yeah.
No.
As far as I know.
Let's remember that Microsoft went to several tablet vendors like Barnes and Noble that used to make the NUC and say, Linux uses my patents, so you have to pay me. He said, but you didn't made a line of the Linux source code. Yes, but it's using my patents. So after checking with the lawyers, I think Barnes and Noble preferred to pay from
Sometimes
Microsoft
that's
to don't have
cheaper.
issues. So
Yeah.
I don't think we are in the position to pay much now. So it's better
And
not, it's
remember
better not to run the risk.
That Oracle filed suit with Google
Yeah.
over components of Java that were present in Android. It's a mess. It's a mess. The point is that when we got the answer from Microsoft, we decided we're just not going to distribute anything that has anything to do with the XFAT. Period.
Does-
Nothing to do with
Does
it.
it encompass all the other FATs also?
Which,
EXFAT, does it
EXFAT.
read like FAT32?
no,
FAT16?
EXFAT reads EXFAT
Only,
only.
okay.
FAT32 is FAT32 only. FAT16 is FAT16
It's
only.
about 64.
Well, there's, which is FAT64?
EX.
EXFAT is FAT64,
FAT64,
yes,
yeah.
yes. But because it's 64-bit FAT, doesn't make it backward compatible with reading a FAT32 volume. So if you don't have a FAT32 driver and you only have an EXFAT driver, you wouldn't be able to read FAT32.
No, but it's possible the driver could have been written in a way that could read both. Right?
Well, and that's essentially the way Valerius sees the FAT32 project. In other words, he's changed most of the references to FAT32 to to UFAT, Universal
He
FAT.
changed them back after I complained.
Thank you.
How's that again, repeat?
Huh?
You were saying?
I just said he changed all of that back after I complained because it breaks a bunch of OS2 tools who were using that label to identify drives,
Okay,
FM2 among them.
yeah, yeah.
So, we just wanted a FAT32 driver. If there's a sea change at some point, and Microsoft says, you know what, we're gonna open up EXFAT to the world, then we'll look at developing an EXFAT IFS, and it will be a standalone EXFAT IFS. So you'll have JFS IFS, HPFS IFS, FAT32 IFS, and EXFAT.IFS. It would just be a separate standalone driver. It would not be part of FAT32 because it's not FAT32. If and when that changes, that's a whole separate issue. As far as the FAT32 driver goes, we just wanted a FAT32 driver. Valerius did not want to make those changes to accommodate us because they didn't meet the goals that he set out for the project for his needs. So forking seemed to be the only way that we could accomplish the things that we needed to do in the FAT32 driver and leave him to do whatever he needed to do on his side. So now there are two FAT32 drivers. There's the NetLabs FAT32 driver and the Arkanoe FAT32 driver. The original project also includes mounting of file system images with a DLL from the QEMU project. That's coming out. If it hasn't been removed from ours, it's going to be removed from ours.
It's also
It's still there.
Right now, it's still
Yeah, in revision 50, I
there. I
guess.
think so.
Yeah, I know that Andy was working on getting it backed out completely, but
I
there were
didn't know the other
some tight hooks in there it takes some time to back it up. This was one of those cases where we started with a snapshot in time after the point where we really should have started. So backing up to get everything pulled out is taking us more time and effort than it might have otherwise. But there were reasons for us starting where we started. There were other fixes that we wanted to get in there, and yeah, it's just kind of the way things worked out. But we knew it going in, and we're working our way through that.
You may end up going back much farther than you expected.
Yeah, well, we
Maybe
may
you
have to.
dashed it.
We may have we may need to restructure our own repository, and it may be that the next Arca OS FAT32 revision is based on an earlier revision of the FAT32 code. We're not quite sure yet. Our next goal is to get a working cache component for FAT32, because especially when you're working on bandwidth constrained devices like USB sticks, without that cache in there, man, reading and writing those things takes forever. Our fork focuses specifically on FAT32, only FAT32. We don't care to replace the kernel's built-in FAT16 support or FAT12 support. We're very happy with the way all of that works, and we don't want anything beyond FAT32 in there, and now we can do that. We have complete control over what we're putting into it. We rewrote the documentation for the FAT32 driver. There was a whole bunch of old stuff that still ships with the NetLabs FAT32 driver for historical purposes. But things like, there's a partition filter driver. It's not even relevant to systems using LVM. Those components don't even work on modern OS2 systems. They're possibly relevant for Warp 3. We didn't need that. So we dumped all that excess baggage so we could focus just on the IFS and documentation specific to the usage of the IFS. The license remains the same, it's all LGPL. So, I could do a whole session on the concepts involved in changing from one open source license to another open source license. It's a really involved subject. The easiest thing to do when you fork is to maintain the same license as the original project.
But would you have, well, this is a philosophical discussion, but would you prefer to have a different license for FAT32? Is there some limitation on LGPL that you find on the license?
Well, see, here's the problem with that. There are a number of concerns here. The original code that was contributed to NetLabs by Hank Kelder was contributed under the LGPL at the time. So we need to look very carefully, if we were to consider using a different license, as to what the implications would be for the code that was contributed under the assumption that it would remain LGPL. I mean, where does that put us when we decide that we want to change it? Do I need to then track down Hank and say to him, look, we have your code and our stuff, but we would like to change the license?
No, but is it useful to change the license? Do you think?
Sometimes. I don't know that it's useful to us.
In this case, okay.
In this case, LGPL works fine for us.
Okay.
It's not a problem at all. And the Arkanoe fork is publicly available because the LGPL requires that we make it publicly available. So you can go to svn.arkanoe.com/FAT32 and download the Arkanoe FAT32 fork source. That's no problem for us.
Okay, but you don't have a need to say, this license is better, I prefer this license and no LGPL.
You know, if it wasn't
For this case.
LGPL, maybe we would be having that conversation. In this case, the LGPL is fine. We hadn't considered that there was anything wrong with it
Okay.
in the first place.
Or a limitation that the license is putting it on.
Yeah, I mean, for us, for this project, LGPL makes sense.
Okay.
It's not a problem.
So you have to use their user ID and password to get into the Arkanoa site to go to SVN?
Not to get to a public repository.
Well, this is public.
Yeah, this is, for read-only purposes. If you want to check it out, you can just go there with an SVN client to svn.arkanoe.com /FAT32. And a trailing slash. Don't forget the trailing slash, that's very important. And you can use, well, you can use an SVN browser, you can use the, you should be able to use either the SVN protocol or HTTPS protocol to get to that server. And you don't need to authenticate or anything, you just download
Okay.
the code.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So some references. NetLabs projects are in NetLabs track. And by the way, if you go to track.netlabs.org, you'll get a page that lists all of the projects that are hosted there. Doesn't give you any descriptions, it just gives you project names. So do some spelunking. The main.
I don't think the links are very good.
The ones that have track spaces are there. There's more stuff in SVN at NetLabs that doesn't have a track page. So for instance, VK Apps just got a track page recently. Netlabs.org is the main site for NetLabs. If you want to host a new project at NetLabs and you need to contact Adrian, go to the main NetLabs site. It's got his contact information on it. Send him a note and ask. He's very accommodating. I've never known Adrian to say to someone, no, I'm not going to host your project on my site. Go away, don't bother me. I've never known him to say anything like that. He's a very approachable guy.
What does it run on?
NetLabs now runs on Linux, on a Linux server, and relatively new hardware. He just did a hardware upgrade earlier this year. So,
And he runs backups.
he does. And no, Adrian's very good about that stuff. He's an IT, he's an admin. So he runs it like any other professional outfit. It's not like he's like running it in the corner of his living room. Now that I said that, he's gonna say to me, no, I actually am running it in the corner of my living room. No, actually, I think it's at a colo site. You know, co-location where they put a whole bunch of servers that are close to an internet backbone. So I think it's at a colo site. If you want to look at hosting it at GitHub, there's the GitHub URL. Go to GitHub. An excellent article by this fellow James Dixon on his personal blog. And interestingly enough, that was not the impetus for the title of this presentation. I had actually started drafting this presentation. I thought, I can't be the first guy to actually write something like this. Someone else must have written something about it. And so I searched, and sure enough, this fellow wrote a blog article that's very good. It's very good, and it talks about a lot of these things. I did add some of his ideas into my remarks. So you might want to check out that site also. The Warpstock presentations are available from the Warpstock site after the event. So just remember to go visit the Warpstock website and download the presentations. So, questions? Yes, sir.
So, getting back to the project I'm considering.
Mhm.
So as you know, as I mentioned, it has 4 platforms, 4 or 5 platforms. And there's a lot of.
If-def in the same trunk.
Right,
Okay.
if-def in the same trunk. And so is there any tools that you're aware of, or that Paul might have worked on, or is there anything out there that can go through the code and say, okay, this piece here, this if-def with this can be ripped out? Like you want to fork it for
Mhm.
purposes of separating it. So is there something that you can do to say, okay, if it's Mac OS or Apple,
Right.
rip
It's
this out.
not relevant to us, so we can
Right.
remove that
Right.
section entirely.
And if it's Windows, rip it out. If it's AIX, rip it out.
Wouldn't that be M4?
If it's Linux, rip it out.
M4 is probably what you'd be looking for to do that, and that is available from the Yum repository.
Yeah.
Install M4, take a look at that, that's a good idea.
GCC might do it anyway. I think they're a right command line switch and just do it in
You
GCC.
mean
You
this
have-
is
No, the
where
thing-
this is where you've mushed code for various OSs
Yeah.
into the same source
Yeah,
code.
Right.
into the same trunk for all of these different platforms.
It'll wipe out your if-defs though, if you do it with the GCC compiler.
I mean, there's another way to do that. You don't need to work that way.
How could you?
That's
Well,
like a
you
disaster.
already got it.
What would you
Well, in
suggest?
our product, we had 3 OSs.
Yeah.
And we had subdirectories for OS-specific
Right.
modules.
Yeah.
Right.
And you have to be disciplined and keep them separate.
That's the way the
And all
Snap
you do is
repository
point
is
at the
built.
one you need for the specific
Yeah.
OS you're building for.
Yeah,
The
unfortunately,
if-defing, oh my God.
everything that they do in this particular project that I'm considering is everything's if-def
Right.
for the 5, 6.
Yeah, pretty common, but
Yeah.
If you want to change from his to
Yeah.
yours, it's kind of a custom macro, right? You know,
yeah.
yeah.
So there's some kind of a custom macro that you write in M4 to go through the entire code source.
Yeah.
And
Only do the language of the platform if-defs. You have
Yeah.
to know what they are, but they're
Yeah.
not there. I don't think it's that hard.
I mean, you could write Python or something to do this, not that
Yeah,
complicated. to
I
do
just
this,
thought
but-
M4 because it's right
so
tool.
Python might be a
Rex or-
choice.
Yeah, you can do it in Rex.
Yeah,
or
Rex.
Python,
Yeah,
Yeah.
those are good for doing.
Whatever
that
you're
stuff.
comfortable with, really.
Yeah.
And
Perl
then
would
you,
do
then
it.
you could put it
Perl.
in your repository.
Yeah,
Okay.
trim all that excess out of there first. The Snap repository is different. The Snap repository is broken down pretty much according to platform. So we
Like the way
use,
I just described.
yeah,
Yes, so that's-
SDD OS2 is was inherited from SciTech Display Doctor for OS2. Then there's STD DOS, there's STD Win,
Windows, yeah.
and so the different platforms are broken down from there. It makes it a heck of a lot easier when you're trying to find something.
Yeah, sure.
And believe me, that's quite a maze of code for Snap. There's an awful lot of stuff in
And
it.
they have like common code that's.
And then there's common code, exactly. See, we licensed from Alt Richmond, the current owner of the SciTech software, the Snap source code and the ability to build OS2 binaries. So we did not license the ability to build Windows binaries. But the code was given to us such that we got everything. So then it was just a choice of, do we just leave that other stuff in the repository or do we trim it out? Well, it hasn't been, the benefits of trimming it out have not yet outweighed the leaving of the code in. So it's sitting in the repository.
Might as well leave it there, why? As long
Yeah,
as
we don't update it, we don't touch it, we build around it, so it really doesn't make much of a difference to us. But if it was all mixed up in the same file, and it made the same files 4 times longer than they needed to be, then it would make sense to go through and get that excess stuff out of there, so we can only build what we needed to build. Oh, we can also distribute DOS binaries. So when we decide to come out with Arca DOS, we should be all set. We can have an accelerated DOS video driver for Arca DOS. Then all we need is hardware on which to run it, and we're all set. So any other questions about, I'm happy to talk about mechanics of forking also, but mainly this was to kind of, in a roundabout way, explain how we got to Arca Noe FAT32. Because I knew that there were people who were going to ask, well, there was already a FAT32, why did you have to have your own? And and the files are named the same, but when you do the install, there's a vendor change. So you have to uninstall the NetLabs FAT32 to install the Arca Noe FAT32. And it wasn't really an issue for us with Arca OS 503 because we distributed FAT32 with the operating system. But if you're going to install it cold, you need to pull the other one out because otherwise the files will conflict, and you'll end up with half of the NetLabs FAT32 installation still in place.
Then use an SVN repository?
Yeah.
And do you run it on Linux or?
OS2.
On OS2, and what version of SVN is it?
1.7.21.
And is there, like, one thing I ran into recently was I couldn't pull stuff out of a repository because the OS2 SVN client was too old.
Oh, you were using the 1.6 client,
Yeah,
right?
is there a newer, where's the newer?
1.7.21. You know where you're going to find
Where
it?
is that?
Look at Paul's Mantis bug tracker. Search SVN. There's a ticket in there where Paul and I were discussing an issue with SVN, and he posted the link to SVN 1.7.21 in the ticket.
That he had built?
Yeah.
And
He
but
built it while we were in the midst of the discussion to try to address a
It needed to
problem.
be
But he didn't put it
uploaded.
up.
I don't know that he actually added it to his
Because
website.
I got it.
From
That's
his
His
website?
yeah.
Oh, so he
It's up
did
there
add it.
some- It's up there somewhere.
So he did put it.
Yeah.
somewhere.
He did add it to his website, so then go to his ports page.
And how new of a client do you need to access the actual newest SVN? Like, it's like 1.8 now or something?
1.8, we're not up to 1.9 for SVN, we're in the 1.8 series now. You can access a 1.8 SVN repository with a 1.7 client, but there are certain operations that you can't do. So it's usually a good idea to have a newer client which will fall back to an older server, if
Right.
need be, than the other way around.
If you have that choice.
But SVN is really forgiving as far as versions, in general.
So Louis, going back onto the how.
Yeah.
Okay, so, ArcOS as installed, just with the bare OS and the bare components that you put in,
Mhm.
are you ready to start a development effort after you've gotten SVN? Or can you take us through some of the things that you need to do to start out again on the platform for development. And I'm talking in a,
Okay,
from the
so-
10-foot.
I know where you're coming from. All right, so what you're gonna wanna do after a base install of Arca OS
Right,
is you're gonna wanna open up Arcanoe Package Manager. You're gonna wanna look at available packages. And, you can change your filtering to look for development packages. And you're going to want to grab the GCC components for the compiler. And as soon as you select GCC and you tell it I want to install GCC, there are going to be a whole bunch of prerequisites that will be selected for you at that point,
Mhm.
including M4. I'm pretty sure M4 is a
Con-
prereq for
configure,
GCC.
auto-config, automate.
Autoconf, automake,
They're not, you have to install those.
those you have
Yeah.
to
No,
pull
they're
separately.
You have to
They're
pull
not,
them.
Yeah.
GCC is not dependent upon those, but it
Okay.
is dependent upon M4,
Okay.
I think.
So you have to
I think.
pull, make, and.
Yeah.
automate
But when
and-
you filter it by development, you can just go down the list. There's no harm in selecting something that would otherwise be auto-selected for you.
Okay,
It really doesn't make a difference.
this all GUI?
Yeah.
Arcanoe Package Manager is all GUI. It's a GUI front end to Yum and RPM.
Okay,
So it really, it makes Yum and RPM much more OS2-like.
Here it is, yeah, M4 is in there.
M4 is a prerequisite for.
okay.
No, I was just looking in the Yum thing, it's.
Oh, yeah.
here.
And then, so then you initiate the process to do basically the Yum, RPM Yum install of GCC, and then you go, and also other things that you've selected.
Yes.
And will you have all your libraries?
It will, well, dependent libraries, it will pull for you when you grab those packages.
The C libraries will be
The C
Yeah.
libraries.
C++ libraries. But
Exactly.
But if you were building against Poplar, say, you'd have to go out and separately get the Poplar development package.
Right.
Yeah,
So it depends on what libraries you need.
yeah, so you have to figure out what your libraries
So if you
are.
need N curses,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
For your project, you're gonna need to get N curses devel. So that's the development package for N curses. If you don't have N curses itself installed, that will be pulled as a prerequisite for N curses devel. One of the things about development packages is you really can't normally install a development package without the main package. It's a prerequisite, but the development package is not a prerequisite for the main package. So if you select N curses devel and you don't have N curses will be selected for you automatically.
Mhm.
If you select just N curses, then you won't get the development package automatically.
So you have to ask, you have to specifically ask for both.
No,
Well, if you're just,
you ask for development.
if you ask for development, you'll get the other package at
Okay.
the same time.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you, there's also a package, I don't remember this exactly, but it's for building the RPMs.
RPM
building
build.
pack- Yeah.
RPM
and
build.
If you, it's a good package to grab, even if you don't intend to do an RPM, because it actually gives you a lot of the other tools that you're
Ah.
gonna
Yeah.
ultimately need.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a key
That's a nice
piece.
missing link.
That's a missing
Mhm.
link, yeah.
RPM build.
RPM build.
Yeah.
Even if you're not planning to package, there are a bunch of tools in there, like, what is the one that we use to dismantle an RPM? CPIO, is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's part of the RPM build package. And the nice thing about that is if you ever need to pick apart an RPM package manually,
Mhm.
that's the tool.
Okay. And then what about is the Whatcom linker, is that part of the
It comes down to GCC.
it comes down with GCC?
Mhm.
Okay,
Yeah.
wonderful. So there's been some great improvement.
Oh, yeah, yeah, we actually, we have a fairly complete usable set of tools for porting, Linux and Unix applications to OS2.
Do you have a wiki or URL that you can point me to?
Everyone asks that.
Yeah,
Um,
Sylvan told me no.
Well,
There
maybe
is-
Martin's got something, because he's got so much stuff all over the place.
Someone asked us at Arcanoe about something like that, and David was working on a development page on the wiki,
Uh-huh.
on the Arcanoe wiki. I don't remember seeing that in the list of wikis, but go to arcanoe.com/wiki and look down the list, and maybe there's something there. David doesn't do a lot of porting. He's not a big fan of GCC. And if you're porting, GCC is the compiler of choice. If you're building native OS2 applications, Watcom is your compiler of choice. David prefers Watcom because he doesn't do a lot of porting. I spend more time in GCC because I do more porting than I do actual building.
This is porting for me.
is- There is a little bit of information on the NetLabs ports site.
Yeah.
And on the NetLabs RPM site, the track sites.
Yeah. Okay.
At some point in time, we have to unify this information so that people can find it. That's a common question.
Yeah.
And quite often, people have said, I mean, how many years did Stu say, I want to have a class
Yeah.
at Warpstock on building something?
Yeah.
And then it's always well, how are we going to do this? Where are we going to find an example to build something? All of that stuff was fleshed out much better for the Linux community
Yeah.
and just not really translated to the OS2 community.
We could
And
do
there-
what they did. We could bring over the GNU Hello World,
That's what we need to do.
all 1.4 megabytes of
Yeah.
the source code for it.
That's what we need to
It's
do.
still Hello World exclamation point,
Right.
but it has all the man pages, it has all the, yeah.
That's really what we need to do. So
Yeah.
it's in several places. The other thing that you're going to want to do is on my server at 2rosenthals.com, I host the GNU ports mailing list,
Oh, yeah.
and you should subscribe to that.
So what is it again? It's
You can, let's see, how can I tell you to get to it? If you go to lists.2rosenthals.com, you should get a page that has a list of mailing lists with archives of the lists, the public lists. Newports does have web archives available. Open up one of the web archives, and in the footer for the list is a link to subscribe to the list. In the footer of a list post. Grab a list post and subscribe to the link. Those of us who port are subscribed to that list. And everyone on that list is really good about giving help. Because I get stuck and then I post to the list.
There is a developers page on your wiki.
There is developers page.
Yeah, and there's a thing it mentions some of the tools, and then it has a link to his own software download stuff.
Yeah,
It's not a lot.
it's the beginning of a page on development. So that there is a developers wiki. I thought that Dave was putting that together. The last thing I'll say about this, how are we doing on time, by the way? I know that I'm back to back.
Oh, we're a little over the end, but we're not up to
Okay,
your,
okay.
not up to your next presentation.
Okay, well, what I will say is that one of the great things, the great strengths of the OS2 community at large is if you go to the Windows community, if you're writing Windows software or something, and you post to some public forum or something about, I'm having a problem writing this for Windows, some 13-year-old is bound to step up and give you the answer. Because, you know, when you're 13, you have all the answers in life, right?
Yeah.
If you go to a Linux forum and you ask that question, you're liable to get RTFM slammed at you,
Right.
you know?
Well,
It's
and-
not my
and rooted.
problem to help you.
And rooted.
Go find it for yourself.
predefined manual.
Okay.
I never have ever seen that in an OS2 forum. Even forums frequented by cantankerous OS2
Yeah.
developers, and we do have a few, we have a handful,
Can
who are very temperamental.
Um,
But I have never seen anyone refuse
Yeah.
to give information
yeah.
or give truly naive information. It's always good stuff. We have very caring, very helpful people in our group of people. And I think that a lot of that comes from the original IBM mainframe culture. The IBM Share Conference still goes on to this day. And everyone is encouraged on a professional level to share his experiences with his peers. And I really think that we reaped the benefits of that over all these years. So if you've got a question, find one of those mailing lists. On the OS2 Voice website, there's a resources page. And on that resources page, there are a whole bunch of lists there. I still have changes I need to submit to you.
Links, yeah.
Yeah, I've got a bunch of tabs that are saved of links that have changed, and I need to get those to you, and I keep
Yeah.
forgetting. But there are resources available and mailing lists. We're still really big on mailing lists in the OS2 community. Subscribe and ask.
Okay.
And just this weekend, I've got a whole new list of links to add to the page.
Excellent,
Yes.
excellent, yes, good. Okay, so that's my spiel on forking an open source project. I don't know whether FAT32 is going to be the only open source project we ever fork to suit our needs, but it's been the first one. So,
About FAT32, are you going to use the VRV 32 libraries for that fork? Do you know?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. What are the benefits of the library? I forgot to.
because it's already done.
No, but does it have something like better functions to talk to the kernel? The DRV 32, what does it
Oh,
offer?
not that, all right, not that DRV32 library, no, we're not gonna
The
use that.
David's.
No,
No,
at least at this point.
not at
it's
this
not
point in
planned.
time.
No, okay.
Not at this point in time, no,
Or,
sorry.
or if you can tell me what is the benefits of that library?
I really, David would be the one to
Yeah,
tell
okay, I
you.
forgot.
I'm-
That's
That's,
David.
that's for device driver, right?
Yeah.
That's really for
The
device
base-
drivers, not for
this is
file
file
systems.
system, which is a different,
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
this
I
is a
forgot.
different,
Yeah.
yeah.
the real benefit of it
Yeah.
is what he's done is he's pulled all the disparate pieces that talk to the OS2 side together into a single place, so that all you have to do is code whatever talks to what you wanna talk to.
Mm-hmm,
And that way you don't have to code the OS2 side of the driver, is
Okay.
the easiest way to think of it.
Okay,
You know, in other words, if you wrote a Bluetooth driver, all you would have to do is write whatever talked to Bluetooth.
okay,
And then you just link it to this.
link it to the, okay, so it will make it easier to make a OS2 device driver,
Yeah,
okay.
And the
Still have to know.
FAT32.
I asked that because I under.
Right.
We added the parts for
I
check
don't
disk and
understand.
format to it. That was
check
that
disk
was
and
Valerian's.
format, and
Valerian's.
that was
But
really
it makes it easy.
my initial requirement for the FAT32 driver.
That's the-
We had no native format capability.
Right.
And no decent check disk
Yeah.
capability. And I said, there's no possible way we can ship a file system driver that we can't format and we can't check.
Yeah.
I mean, it's ridiculous, just, how do you ship that as a driver? That's not complete.
Yeah.
So when I mentioned it to Bitwise in one of our monthly intercompany meetings, Sylvan said to me, we have someone working on that.
Yeah.
I had no idea, it was Valerius.
Okay.
There were certain things that were apparently needed for the Bitwise VirtualBox port. That's how he started working on the FAT32 system. So that's where it all came. That's how we sort of inherited Valerius in the project. I was happy that they had someone working on it.
Yeah.
That was great, and he made some great strides with formatting and implemented a lot of stuff that I asked him to implement. But then he just kept going down a path that was far afield from what we ever wanted or what we could distribute.
Yeah.
And he said, well, it's all if-depth, so just don't build it with that. Well, we don't want that code in
Yeah.
anywhere near what we're distributing.
Mm-hmm.
And it was difficult for me to get the point across.
Yeah.
So ultimately, we just said, let's just do it ourselves, because Andy was already building it at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And then Greg got involved in working on some of the FAT32 stuff. And I thought, well, I got two guys who are competent and they're working on the code already, so why am I getting frustrated here? So that's what we decided to do. If we do that with other things, I don't know. I don't know what other things we might do that.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see.
Is there IBM documentation on how you write a file system?
Yeah.
I guess there must
Yeah,
be.
yeah.
Yeah, there's a document that actually ships with the NetBrowse FAT32 package called ifs.inf. And it's an IBM document. Now, there are about 4 or 5 revisions of that document floating around, And Valerius has actually updated IBM's document with some of his own stuff.
Huh.
I'm not talking about the copyright implications there at all, about modifying IBM's document. Anyway, that document is sort of the Bible of writing files, installable file systems.
Is that in your source code repository also?
We don't include that document. The document's available from Hobbs. You can download it directly from
No,
Hobbs.
okay.
I mean, as far as I know, IBM made it freely available.
It is also available on the ADM2 wiki.
Yes, it's there
Oh,
also.
okay. Yeah. I think that's
Check
what
the
I saw.
versions, check the file size, check the date,
Check the Estonian.
check the number of pages. Yeah, check the Estonian, exactly, exactly.
So you're implementing it as a .ifs?
Mm-hmm,
Yeah.
yeah. It's, instead of as a NetDrive plugin. See,
Mhm.
NetDrive is great for certain things, particularly network file systems where you wouldn't be formatting them anyway because it's remote.
They're on the network, yeah.
But for a file system like FAT32, which is a local file system, NetDrive is not an ideal choice because there's a lot of stuff you can't do with it. You can't do a check disk, you can't do a format.
Check this format, micro file system driver,
Micro
it's only
file
used for bootable.
I'm not familiar with that.
Oh, when the kernel boots and it first wants to draw files from the file system, it loads the micro stuff.
Oh yeah, the mini FSD.
Mini FSD.
Mini FSD is in the kernel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, but, I mean, it's not, the one for JFS isn't, it's a part of the JFS distribution, right? And HBFS,
HBFS and JFS get loaded after.
What?
The mini JFS.
the mini.
No, not mini JFS, but the mini file system, the FAT16 support and HBFS support is in the kernel.
Oh, okay, I see. But, I mean, if you were to add a bootable one, it would be in the micro, or mini file.
Most
system drive,
likely, yeah, yeah. it would be
And
on mini
you
FSD.
didn't do anything, or Valerius did.
In order to boot from FAT32 or something?
Is that something he did, you know?
That's something he did,
He did do it.
well, there is the beginning of boot support in
Uh-huh.
the NetLabs FAT32 IFS.
Oh, really? Okay,
Oops.
yeah.
But you know, you gotta ask yourself, why would I ever wanna boot from FAT32?
No, of course,
I
but-
mean, seriously, what's that gonna get me in the long run? In other words,
World domination.
Can I ask another dumb question
Shoot.
about file systems?
the only dumb questions are the ones that don't get asked.
So network, the NTFS,
Mhm.
is there anything besides some of the stuff on Hobbs for NTFS support?
There is a NetDrive plugin for NTFS.
There's a net drive, okay.
And there's an ifs, which doesn't, there's an ifs file driver for it.
Yeah, but that was
Doesn't
read,
work
it's
with-
read only, I
Yeah.
think, yeah.
Okay,
The NetDrive plugin is read write.
okay.
Really?
Yeah, the NetDrive NTFS plugin is read write, yeah.
Okay, and it works?
Yeah.
Yeah.
As far as I know, it works fairly well. And performance is better than the NTFS IFS. There's-
Is NTFS that's a proprietary thing?
That's Microsoft's
Microsoft.
proprietary Next Technology File System.
Based on HPFS,
Mhm.
that, the next advancement.
Right, but how do these people, Microsoft doesn't care, basically? They write these NTFS drivers and.
All I can tell you is that we don't distribute it, so as far as the legality of distributing an NTFS file system driver, I have no idea. I know that we can distribute a FAT16 and a FAT32 file system driver, according to, as far as my understanding of Microsoft's licensing for that technology. For NTFS, anyone's guess, I've never looked. I've never looked.
Oh, another question is, can you JFS also can be, you can use it on Linux, right?
Yeah,
Are they
JFS is.
interoperable? Like, if you have a JFS partition on OS2, can it be read by a Linux?
Yes.
Yes,
that has-
The
it
reverse
can
isn't
be.
true.
The reverse is,
Yeah.
the reverse is not true. So in other words, if you format a file system with JFS under Linux, with the JFS kernel driver,
Mhm.
you will likely not be able to read that reliably under OS2. But a JFS volume created, let's say with DFC and then formatted, DFC under OS2 and formatted under OS2, yeah, you can read that from Linux.
Now, why is that?
The version of the JFS file system that was open sourced that became the Linux JFS now has had significant updates to it from the version that IBM released for OS2, and that became the basis for the what we call the bootable JFS that we have now.
Yeah, they open sourced the AIX version, as I recall.
Yeah, exactly.
And then they put
exactly.
out JFS 2.
So it's possible David, when he has nothing else to do, could incorporate those changes?
Well,
from
Steve
Linux?
has often said that one of the things that's still on his bucket list is to sync the code with the Linux JFS.
Mhm.
Whether we'll actually see that or not, I don't know. There are certain things like that dumb check disk error that David mentioned before. And that comes up when you have a large volume that doesn't have a lot of free space, generally. And the error will say, unable to read M from M. And what it is it can't read the metadata from something else. It's a very cryptic error message. Happens on Linux also, but not as often anymore because those updates, that was generally fixed on the Linux OpenJFS. So there are fixes in that code that would be nice for us to have in our JFS. I've argued that we need another file system besides JFS, because JFS is not the established standard file system that IBM had hoped that it would have become. In fact, most Linux distributions have pulled JFS out of their standard distributions. So, OpenSUSE, for instance, does not install JFS. You have to install JFS and recompile the kernel after the fact, if you want it now. You can't do it at install time. You can install. Generally, most Linux distributions are using BTRFS, ButterFS, which supports snapshotting and a whole bunch of other really neat and handy features that JFS doesn't do. I mean, most modern file systems journal like JFS, but they do other things like snapshots and compression and all sorts of neat stuff like that. BTR is a standard one. I talked to Paul, to Jan about adding BTRFS support to DFC, and it turned out to be a pretty big thing when he started looking at it. So BTR was one of the file systems that I've been talking about replacing JFS with. XFS, ZFS from Sun, from Solaris, ZFS. They're all good file systems, and they all support extended attributes. Unlike, ext4 supports extended attributes, but only up to 64K of extended attributes, which means that it's not a really good choice for an OS2 system where you could have a desktop that's got lots and lots and lots of extended attributes. But some other Linux file systems like XFS, just like JFS, are unlimited extended attribute storage size. So there are other choices, but they take a considerable amount of effort to get them ported to OS2, and we have a working file system now that technically, when we have the ability to support volumes greater than 2 terabytes, will scale with us. So in other words, the 2 terabyte limitation is not in our JFS port.
It's in the US.
It's in OS2 DASD. That's where the issue is. Someone recently posted a question to the sales mailbox at Arcanoe, asking about the 2 terabyte limitation in LVM. There is no 2 terabyte limitation in LVM. LVM doesn't care about volume size. Doesn't care about that at all. It's OS2 DASD that cares about that stuff. All the rest of the stuff is all logical on top of whatever else is there. So JFS has no problem with a 64 terabyte volume. That's not an issue. We have no, it's a 64-bit file system. So that's not gonna be a problem for us. But we don't see those devices. That's the problem for us. So JFS isn't gonna hold us back when we have the other components in place. When we get all the other components in place and we have nothing else left to do, you know, Arca OS version 7.5, then we'll think for Arca OS 8, maybe we'll add XFS or ZFS. That's about how far down the list it is.
And what about this OS2 NASD? That's something that's gonna be remedied?
Ask Greg.
Greg, is that something that's gonna be remedied?
Yeah, I'm supposed to be reverse engineering.
Ah.
We didn't find it.
It's on the list, but it's after FAT32 gets fixed.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, there's this. It's like when a guy approached me to repoint my chimney, and he gave me a price on the work, and it wasn't a bad price. And I said, all right, I'll add that to the list. And he looked at me. He said, well, I thought you wanted me to start right away. I said, no. I said, I have a list. And I just added you to the bottom of that list, and the list is about that long. Now, the next guy who comes along may be below you on that list or maybe above you on that list, I really can't say. Right now, you're on the list down at the bottom. You know, chimney's still up there, it hasn't fallen over, and it's like not leaking water, so repointing, yeah, it'd be nice, but it's not necessarily something I have to do tomorrow. If I start seeing water around my fireplace and all of a sudden it gets bumped up the list, it's amazing how that happens, you know? But you know, we fixed some stuff in Arca OS that was just like that. That full screen hang thing. That's been around for a long time. And it's not, again, as David explained, it's not a full screen issue, it's a multi-processor issue. We knew that it was a problem, it was on the list. David said, look, if we're going to fix this, I need to have hardware because I can't replicate the problem. It wasn't a real problem until it was a real problem. Then we got the hardware and then he fixed it. So it's the same way with changing file systems and recognizing disks that are bigger than 2 terabytes.
Normally, we'd have had a break at 3 o'clock. However, the snacks that were supposed to be delivered haven't arrived. However, leftovers from lunch are still here, and there's a number of cans of soft drinks, a number of desserts. I'm not sure what else without looking, because I see people have been helping themselves. So if you want a can of pop,
Yeah,
Max
please.
is behind me, and
Please feel free. Consider this the sort of intercession
Alright.
break. I'm just sort of standing up here juggling.
Yeah.
Oh, I have a
did you say juggling or struggling?
Or struggling to juggle.
Struggling with
Right.
both.